Say, deep in the Cascade Mountains, a logging road disappears into fog. No signs, no cell signal. Stace. At the end of that road, a cabin sits rotting into the earth. The porch sags. The windows are blind with grime.
Inside, a woman kneels on the broken floor. Her hands are blistered. Sawdust coats her face.
But the steel tip strikes something hard. Not wood, metal. A sound rings through the cabin like a bell.
When the lawyer handed over the deed to a rotting cabin in the mountains, her siblings laughed. They walked out of that office with millions prime real estate, family trust accounts, a collection of vintage automobiles worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. Wren Calloway walked out with a folder so thin she could feel the brass key through the cardboard. Her brother told her to let him know if she needed a few $100 for a demolition crew. Her sister smoothed her silk slacks, offered a smile that carried the precise warmth of a closed bank window, then disappeared into the back seat of a town car. People had always underestimated Wren. They confused quietness for weakness, modesty for incompetence. But family trees rot from the inside out, from roots no one bothers to inspect. The joke, as it turned out, was on every single one of them. Because what lay beneath the floorboards of that miserable cabin would buy their entire lives 10 times over. Before we continue, if stories about hidden truth mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, but it means the world. Now let's go back to where it started. The mahogany conference table in Mr. Pemberton's office had been polished to a mirror finish. It was the kind of table that existed solely to remind visitors they were sitting across from money. Old money. The kind that smelled like leather briefcases, imported stationery, dust from vaults that hadn't been opened in decades. Wren stared at the distorted reflection of her own hands against that glossy wood. Rough knuckles, a chipped thumbnail, the fading ink stain from a ballpoint pen she'd used to calculate her grocery budget that morning. A budget built around what was on sale at the store down the block, not around what she actually wanted to eat. Across the table, Margot's reflection was a blur of cream cashmere, a tennis bracelet catching the overhead light with each deliberate movement of her wrist. She sat perfectly upright, legs crossed at the ankle, chin lifted at an angle that had taken years of private school to perfect. Beside her, Sterling scrolled through his phone with one thumb, his tailored navy suit shifting across his shoulders with every restless gesture. He hadn't looked up since he sat down. He already knew what was coming. They both did. Mr. Pemberton adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He was a thin man in his 70s, precise in his movements, careful with his words. He opened a leather-bound folder, turned to the first page of heavy parchment paper, cleared his throat with the mechanical detachment of someone who had delivered 1,000 such readings. His voice came out dry, papery. To my eldest granddaughter, Margot Elise Calloway, I leave the primary estate in Monterey, California, along with the liquid assets held in the family trust. Margot didn't blink. She gave a single, tight nod practiced, expected, a gesture she had likely rehearsed in the mirror that morning. It was exactly what she had spent 20 years, earning through carefully performed devotion. Every holiday visit, every bottle of imported whiskey carried to the old man's door, every patient nod through his paranoid ramblings about collapsing banks, it had all been an investment. The return was now confirmed. Pemberton turned a page. To my grandson, Sterling Wade Calloway, I leave the commercial real estate portfolio, the holding company registered under Calloway Industrial Partners, along with the vintage automobile collection housed at the Monterey property. Sterling locked his phone screen, slid it into his breast pocket. His posture straightened with the quiet confidence of a man collecting what he believed was owed. His voice carried the clipped efficiency of someone already 2 steps ahead. Mr. Pemberton, is there a timeline on the title transfers? My team can have the paperwork processed by Thursday. Pemberton didn't answer immediately. He turned another page, slower this time, as though the parchment had grown heavier. Nobody looked at Wren. Nobody ever looked at Wren. She was the middle child, the anomaly. The one who hadn't gone to law school, hadn't married a venture capitalist, hadn't learned the art of smiling with her teeth while calculating someone's net worth behind her eyes. She managed a regional hardware store in a suburb outside Portland. She drove a 12-year-old Subaru with a cracked passenger window held together with packing tape. Her coat was from a clearance rack 3 winters ago. She was, by every metric her family recognized, invisible. Pemberton's voice dropped half a register. To my middle granddaughter, Wren Calloway, I leave the property known as the Hemlock Ridge tract, including the structure situated upon it. Sterling frowned, his thumb hovering over his pocket. Hemlock Ridge, is that the hunting lodge outside Aspen? No. Pemberton's gaze dropped to his papers. Something flickered across his face, not quite discomfort, but close. It is a half-acre lot in the Cascade Mountains, near a township called Bitter Creek. A modest structure. Taxes are current. He slid a manila folder across the polished mahogany. It stopped exactly 1 inch from Wren's hands, as though even the folder understood the geometry of this family. Inside was a single sheet, the deed along with a tarnished brass key taped to the inner cover. The key was small, heavy for its size, its edges stained green with decades of oxidation. Margot let out a breath that hovered dangerously close to laughter. Her voice carried the brittle politeness of someone delivering a compliment they didn't mean. The old logging cabin. I thought the county condemned that place years ago. She stood, smoothing her slacks with both palms. Let me know if you need a few hundred for the demolition team, Wren. Truly, I'm fine. Wren's voice was flat, controlled, devoid of the hurt they were both listening for, the flinch they had come to expect. She had stopped hurting over her family's dismissals when she was 17 years old, sitting alone at a Thanksgiving table while Margot held court over dessert. Now it was just a dull, persistent fact of gravity. Water is wet. The sky is blue. Wren gets the scraps. She picked up the folder. It weighed almost nothing. That night, alone in her apartment, Wren sat on the edge of her bed with the folder open on her knees. She turned the brass key over in her fingers. It was too heavy for a simple padlock, too deliberately made. She rubbed her thumb across the head of the key, feeling the rough texture beneath the green patina, but didn't examine it further. She dropped it back into the folder, closed the cover, set it on her nightstand. Her mind drifted to the last time she had seen Edmund alive. 3 years ago, his Monterey mansion. She'd driven down on a Saturday unannounced. Margot's Mercedes was already in the circular driveway. Sterling's leased Porsche beside it. Inside, they were in the sunroom. Margot was pouring Edmund a glass of single malt from a bottle that cost more than Wren's monthly car payment. Sterling sat in a leather wingback chair, nodding along as the old man talked. Edmund's voice had grown thin by then, reedy, stripped of the industrial baritone that had once commanded scrapyards full of men twice his size. But his eyes were the same, sharp, watchful, cataloging every reaction like a man keeping a private ledger. He was talking about banks, the way he always talked about banks. Digital money is a fiction, he said. When the grid goes down, the only thing that holds value is what you can carry in your hands. Every dollar in a server is a promise from someone who doesn't know your name. Margot poured. Sterling nodded. They had perfected the choreography, the attentive lean forward, the murmured agreement, the careful handling of an old man's paranoia, like a fragile antique they needed to keep intact until the estate cleared probate. Wren had stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching. Then she had walked across the room, taken the whiskey glass out of Edmund's hand, set it on the side table, looked him in the eye. You need to take your medication, not drink whiskey at 2 in the afternoon. The room went silent. Margot's jaw tightened. Sterling exhaled through his nose. Edmund stared at Wren for a long, unreadable moment. His expression wasn't anger. It wasn't amusement. It was something she couldn't name, a stillness behind his eyes that she had interpreted at the time as disappointment. Now, sitting in her apartment with a worthless deed on her lap, she wondered if that look had meant something else entirely. 4 days later, the Subaru's suspension screamed as it hit another rut on the unpaved logging road. The rain in the Cascades didn't fall, it hung in the air like a freezing curtain of gray mist that coated everything in a slick, oily film. Wren gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her eyes straining through the rhythmic squeak of failing windshield wipers. The GPS on her phone had lost its signal 2 hours ago. She was navigating by a set of printed directions that read less like a map, more like a scavenger hunt written by someone who distrusted precision on principle. Turn left at the rusted tractor. Follow the gravel past the dead oak. Bear right where the creek forks below the boulder shaped like a fist. Before the mountain road, she had stopped in Bitter Creek. The town wasn't dead, but it was dying. She could feel it the way you feel a fever breaking, something fundamental losing its grip. Main Street was 4 blocks long. Half the storefronts were boarded, plywood bleached gray by years of mountain weather. A church with a white steeple sat at the far end, its paint peeling in long, curling strips that hung from the clapboard like dead skin. A gas station with 2 pumps, neither of which looked operational. A post office the size of a garden shed. One building had lights on. A general store with a hand-painted sign above the door, Marsden's General. The letters were faded but carefully maintained, touched up in spots where the mountain winters had eaten through the paint. Wren pushed through the front door. A brass bell above the frame gave a tired ring. The interior smelled like pine floor cleaner, old cardboard, coffee that had been sitting on a burner too long. Shelves lined with canned goods, batteries, fishing line, motor oil, wool socks. The kind of store that sold everything you might need to survive, nothing you might want for comfort. Behind the counter stood a woman in her mid-70s. Silver hair pulled back in a loose braid, reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. Her back carried a slight curve, the kind that comes not from weakness but from decades of leaning over counters, lifting inventory, sweeping floors. Her eyes, though her eyes were sharp, quick, the pale blue of creek water over granite. Wren set a pack of D-cell batteries on the counter. "I'm looking for Hemlock Ridge. Do you know the way?" The woman, Opal, according to the faded name tag pinned to her flannel shirt, didn't answer immediately. Her hands paused on the register keys. She studied Wren's face with the quiet patience of someone who had learned to read strangers the way other people read weather. Opal's voice was low, steady, long time since anyone asked for directions up there. "Did you know the man who owned it?" Opal looked past Wren through the front window toward the gray line of mountains above the tree line. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted, a door closing softly in a back room. "He came through here. Sometimes. Never stayed long." She rang up the batteries. "Road's rough past the fork. Keep left where the gravel turns to mud or you'll end up in the creek bed." Wren paid. Opal gave her change without counting it aloud, the way people do when they've handled the same register for 40 years. Wren felt it, the weight of something unspoken hanging between them, heavy as the mist outside. But she didn't push. She pocketed the change, thanked the woman, walked back out into the gray. She found the cabin 20 minutes later. It wasn't a lodge. It wasn't a retreat. It wasn't anything that belonged in a sentence with the word inheritance. It was a rotting wooden box sinking into the mud on a steep rocky grade surrounded by Douglas firs, so dense they blocked the sky. Wren killed the engine. The silence that followed was enormous, not peaceful but pressurized. No highway hum, no distant sirens. Nothing but the heavy, rhythmic dripping of water from pine needles onto the Subaru's roof. She stepped out. Her boots sank an inch into the mud. The front porch sagged in the center like a broken spine. The wood blackened with moisture, covered in a thick carpet of velvet green moss. One window was boarded with rotting plywood. The other was cracked, the glass clouded by decades of grime so thick it looked painted on. The cabin listed slightly to the left, as though the mountain itself was slowly shrugging it off. This was her inheritance. This was what honesty had purchased. Edmund had been a strange man. He made his fortune in the 70s, buying up failing industrial operations at fire sale prices, stripping them for scrap metal, selling the raw materials at profit margins that made his accountants nervous. Then he'd spent the last 2 decades of his life barricaded in his Monterey mansion, curtains drawn, complaining about the government, the collapse of the banking system, the fragility of digital currency. Margot brought him whiskey. Sterling brought him investment reports designed to look impressive. Wren had told him to take his pills. Honesty, she calculated, had cost her roughly $30 million. She climbed the 3 porch steps. They groaned under her weight like something in pain. She pulled the brass key from the manila folder. The padlock on the front door was rusted, nearly shut. She jammed the key in, but the mechanism was so corroded the key barely fit. She hit the lock with the heel of her hand hard. The shackle popped open without the key turning at all. Brute force, not precision. She shoved the key back into her jacket pocket, thinking it was useless. The door scraped heavily against the floorboards as she kicked it inward. The smell hit her first. Stagnant, freezing air thick with the scent of wet paper, rodent droppings, decaying pine resin. She pulled a heavy-duty flashlight from her coat, clicked it on. The beam cut through a dense suspension of dust motes that hung in the air like frozen snow. A single large room, a collapsed sofa in the center, its stuffing pulled out by generations of mice. A rusted cast-iron wood stove in the far corner, its exhaust pipe eaten through with corrosion. Warped floorboards curling up at the edges like dead leaves. Above, a massive brown water stain bloomed across the ceiling planks, the wood so saturated it looked ready to give way entirely. Wren whispered into the vapor of her own breath, "Perfect." She wasn't going to cry. Crying was for people who still had hope left to lose. Wren was a pragmatist. She did the math standing in the doorway, flashlight beam trembling slightly in her grip. The land was practically worthless, steep, rocky miles from any paved road. To sell it, she'd need the cabin demolished, which would cost more than her savings account held. If she walked away, the county would seize it for back taxes within 2 years, a hit on her credit she couldn't afford. The only viable option, clean it out, patch the roof enough to keep it standing, find some off-grid survivalist on the internet willing to pay a few $1,000 for a miserable slice of nowhere. She set her bag on the driest patch of floor she could find. A crowbar, a box of heavy-duty trash bags, a hammer, 3 days off work. She looked around the decaying room, her jaw set tight. Her voice came out quiet, directed at no one. "All right, Edmund. Let's see what kind of mess you left me." Morning arrived not as sunlight but as a marginally lighter shade of gray seeping through the cracked window. Wren woke freezing, wrapped in 2 sleeping bags on an inflatable mattress that had slowly deflated during the night, leaving her hip pressed against the cold floorboards. Her back ached from the base of her skull to her tailbone. She rolled out, fired up a portable butane stove on the porch, boiled water for instant coffee. The bitter, acidic liquid tasted like salvation, hot, sharp, proof that she was still functioning. She drank it standing on the sagging porch, looking out at the dense wall of ancient firs. The forest was beautiful in a brutal prehistoric way. It was also completely, utterly isolating. If she snapped an ankle out here, she would die of exposure before anyone noticed she was gone. No one was expecting her back. No one had asked where she was going. She set the mug down. Time to work. Respirator mask strapped tight. Thick leather work gloves. Crowbar in hand. The priority was the floor near the cast-iron stove. The boards there were spongy underfoot, dangerous. If a potential buyer stepped through the floor during a walkthrough, any chance of a sale was dead. She wedged the flat end of the crowbar between 2 warped pine planks. Threw her weight backward. The wood gave a wet, tearing sound, splintering apart, releasing a gust of trapped moisture that smelled like black earth. Underneath, compacted dirt, black mold, the pale threads of fungal networks spreading through the soil like veins. She moved to the next board. Wedge, pull, tear. The rhythm became something physical, almost meditative. With every rusted nail she yanked from the rotting wood, she imagined pulling out a piece of her family's condescension. Wedge Margot's practiced smile at the reading. Pull. Wedge Sterling's offer of demolition money. Pull. Wedge 20 years of being the invisible middle, the one no one consulted, the one whose opinion carried the weight of background noise. Pull. For 3 hours she worked on her hands, her knees. The muscles in her shoulders burned. Sweat coated her forehead, mixing with sawdust, griming her skin into a mask of effort. She cleared a 5x5 section, tossing the rotting planks through the front door into a growing pile in the mud outside. Between the exposed joists, wedged into a gap where 2 support beams met, she found a small, leather-bound notebook. The cover had mostly disintegrated, but several interior pages survived, protected by the density of the binding. She brushed off the dirt. The handwriting was sharp, angular, pressed hard into the paper, the penmanship of a man who wrote the way he spoke, with force. Numbers filled the margins. Copper prices per pound. Gold spot rates, currency conversion ratios, dates from the early 2000s, Edmund's handwriting, Edmund's oscillations, reduced to ink on paper, buried under his own floor. Deeper in the wall cavity, behind a section of crumbling insulation, she found a photograph. Black and white, faded to sepia at the edges. A young man, tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair pushed back from a sun-weathered face, standing in front of an industrial building. Behind him, a wooden sign read, Bitter Creek Lumber Co. The man was smiling. Not the guarded, calculating expression Wren remembered from Edmund's later years, but an open, genuine smile. The smile of someone who hadn't yet become the person he would spend the rest of his life regretting. Wren slipped the notebook into a Ziploc bag from her kit. The photograph she held a moment longer, studying the young man's face, the mill behind him, the trees on the ridge above. Then she sealed it in the bag with the notebook, tucked it into her coat, returned to the floor. She shifted closer to the cast-iron stove. The wood here was different, thicker, heavier, inexplicably dry despite the massive leak in the roof directly above. She drove the crowbar into the seam between two boards. Instead of sinking into soft rot, the steel tip struck something hard. The sound that traveled up the shaft wasn't the dull thud of wet wood. It was a metallic ring, a dense, heavy clack that vibrated through the crowbar into her forearms, her wrists, the bones of her hands. She stopped, tapped the crowbar against the board again. Clack. She scraped the flat edge along the seam, tearing away a thick layer of compacted dust, grease, decades of grime. What emerged underneath wasn't wood at all. It was steel solid, painted a dull matte brown to blend seamlessly with the surrounding pine planks. A steel plate, roughly 4 feet wide by 4 feet long, set perfectly flush with the floor. At the edge nearest the stove, a recessed channel had been machined into the metal. Inside the recess sat a heavy iron D-ring, rusted but intact. Wren knelt beside it. Her heart performed a slow, deliberate roll in her chest, not the rapid hammering of panic, but the deep, gravitational thud of something fundamental shifting. Edmund's paranoia, his obsessive ranting about banks failing, about digital assets being fiction, about the government tracking every wire transfer. Everyone had assumed he was a wealthy old man losing his mind to age. Margot brought whiskey to manage him. Sterling brought spreadsheets to distract him. Neither of them had considered, not once, that a man who distrusted every institution in the modern world might have done something about it. Millions of dollars had vanished from Edmund's holdings in the 3 years before his death. Sterling had spent months hunting through shell companies, estate filings, financial databases. He found nothing. The money had simply evaporated, as though Edmund had converted it into smoke. Wren stared at the D-ring. She grabbed it with both gloved hands, planted her boots on either side of the plate, pulled. Nothing. The seal was fused shut, rust bonded to rust, gravity pressing down like a closed fist. She wasn't going to let a piece of metal beat her. Not today. Not after everything. She threaded the crowbar through the D-ring, positioned a sturdy piece of salvaged oak beneath as a fulcrum, put her entire body weight onto the lever, every pound she had. Her boots slid on the gritty floor. Her shoulders screamed. She gritted her teeth, pushed harder. A crack split the silence like a rifle, shot the rust seal breaking. Wren scrambled back, chest heaving. She grabbed the D-ring again, pulled. This time the steel plate lifted. Hidden hinges shrieked as she heaved the massive door upward, flipping it over until it slammed onto the adjacent planks with a concussive boom that shook dust from the ceiling's beams. She expected the smell of damp earth. She expected a shallow root cellar packed with moldy canning jars. Instead, a rush of cold, perfectly dry, chemically filtered air hit her face. It smelled like ozone, machine oil, something sterile, the opposite of everything above. She aimed her flashlight into the dark. The beam hit concrete. Smooth, poured concrete, not dirt. A set of industrial steel stairs descended into blackness roughly 10 feet down. At the bottom, a landing. At the landing, a door. Not a wooden door, a vault door. Solid steel, painted military olive drab, with a massive circular locking wheel in the center. It looked like something salvaged from a decommissioned missile, silo-engineered for a war that never came, repurposed for a paranoia that never stopped. Built into the concrete wall beside the door, a heavy black keypad. A single red LED blinked in the gloom, steady, patient, powered by something invisible. Wren's mind raced. The cabin had no electricity, no connection to any grid. She backed out of the opening, walked around the exterior of the cabin. Behind the structure, half buried under moss, dead pine needles, years of accumulated forest debris. She found it a metal housing the size of a large toolbox, bolted to a concrete pad sunk into the hillside. She cleared the camouflage with her hands. Inside the housing, 2 industrial propane tanks connected to a fuel cell generator. The system was elegant, self-contained, designed to run at minimal output for years, just enough power to keep a dehumidification system operational underground, enough to maintain a keypad, a few LED circuits. Edmund hadn't relied on batteries. He had engineered a self-sustaining power supply disguised as forest floor, invisible to anyone who wasn't on their hands, their knees, pulling back the earth itself. Wren returned to the opening. She sat on the edge, her legs dangling over the concrete stairwell, flashlight gripped in both hands. The forest pressed in around the cabins, silent, indifferent, ancient. It had kept this secret for years. Without effort, she climbed down. The steel stairs clanged under her muddy boots. Each step rang out sharp, metallic percussion bouncing off poured concrete walls. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 10 steps. Her breath returned in thick white plumes, illuminated by the shaking beam of her flashlight. She reached the landing. The vault door loomed before her. Massive rotary wheel, heavy locking pins sunk deep into the reinforced concrete frame. The olive drab paint was faded but unblistered. The climate control had kept the air down here bone dry for years, maybe a decade. The keypad, 9 plastic squares coated in a thin film of undisturbed dust. A red LED blinking with mechanical patience. 6 digits. She needed 6 digits. Wren tried Edmund's birthday. A sharp error tone bounced off the walls. She tried the anniversary of his marriage to their grandmother, a union that had dissolved into mutual Arctic silence decades ago. Another error tone. She stood in the cold, her jaw tight, thinking. Edmund despised birthdays. He called them arbitrary markers on a biological countdown clock. He wouldn't have used an anniversary for a marriage he considered a contractual failure. He was a man of tangible things, weights, measures, scrap metal, copper wire. He dealt in the physical world, in numbers that meant something real. She climbed back up the stairs, sat on the cabin floor beside the open hatch. She pulled out the manila folder, the same folder Pemberton had slid across the mahogany table, opened it, spread the deed flat under her flashlight. She'd read it once in the lawyer's office, barely glancing at the legal language. Now she read it again. Every word, every margin. There, bottom right corner, almost invisible, written in pencil, so light it could have been a stray mark, a slip of the hand. 6 digits in Edmund's handwriting, 824096. She pulled the brass key from her pocket, held it under the beam, scraped her chipped thumbnail across the oxidized head, digging through the green patina. Beneath the corrosion, stamped into the brass, the same 6 numbers, 824096. 2 clues. The deed she was guaranteed to read. The key she was guaranteed to hold. Redundancy built into redundancy, the architecture of a man who trusted nothing to chance, who understood that systems fail but backups survive. Wren descended again. She stood before the keypad, pressed 8. A sharp electronic beep. 24096. She waited 2 seconds of silence, the longest 2 seconds of her life, the red LED blinking its slow, indifferent rhythm. Then, with a soft click, the light turned solid green. Deep inside the door, heavy metal tumblers shifted. The sound was deeply satisfying, oiled, precise, the mechanical voice of a lock, acknowledging the correct answer to a question it had been holding for years. Wren grabbed the rotary wheel, planted her boots on the concrete floor, braced her shoulder against the cold steel, turned. The wheel moved smoothly, balanced on high-end bearings that hadn't degraded in the controlled atmosphere. Locking pins retracted into the door frame with the series heavy sequential thuds. She pulled the handle. The door weighed close to a ton, but it swung outward, with barely a whisper, precision engineering operating exactly as designed, years after the engineer had stopped breathing. As the seal broke, overhead lights flickered to life. Not harsh fluorescence, but warm, low-draw LEDs running along the ceiling of a room roughly 20 feet wide by 30 feet deep. The air inside was sterile, climate-controlled. Industrial dehumidifiers hummed softly in the back corners, fed by the same propane fuel cell system she'd found outside. Wren stepped over the raised threshold. She lowered her flashlight. It was unnecessary now. The room was lined with heavy-duty steel shelving units, commercial grade, the kind used in warehouses to hold engine blocks, industrial machinery. But these shelves held something else entirely. On the left wall, stacked with the casual precision of ordinary bricks, were rows of dull yellow bars. Wren walked toward them, her legs feeling strangely disconnected from her body, as though the floor had become unreliable. She stopped in front of the nearest shelf, reached out, touched one of the bars with her gloved hand. It was freezing, incredibly dense, the weight concentrated in a volume far smaller than her brain expected. Stamped into the top, 999 fine gold. 1 kilo. There were dozens of them. Row after row, shelf after shelf, she turned. On the right wall, the shelving held silver ingots, massive 100-ounce bars stacked in neat geometric towers, their surfaces carrying the dull pewter sheen of unpolished, precious metal. Next to them sat rows of heavy black pelican cases, military spec, waterproof, crush-proof. Wren unlatched the nearest case, popped the lid. Inside, vacuum-sealed in thick industrial plastic, were stacks of perfectly crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. Bundles of 10,000, row after row after row. Edmund hadn't lost his mind. He had simply lost his faith in the world above ground. He had taken his liquid fortune, the millions that Sterling spent months hunting through digital records, corporate filings, banking databases, converted it into untraceable physical assets, carried it here in trips no one monitored, stored it in a vault no one knew existed, beneath a cabin no one wanted, on land no one valued. The most valuable thing in the Calloway estate had been given to the person the Calloways valued least. In the center of the room, sitting on a small metal folding table, was a single piece of white stationery. A heavy tungsten paperweight held it flat. Wren walked to the table. Her boots made no sound on the smooth concrete. She slid the paperweight aside, picked up the paper. Edmund's handwriting pressed hard into the fiber, each letter carved with the deliberate force of a man who treated every written word as something permanent. Wren, if you are reading this, it means you actually showed up. It means you didn't hire a bulldozer to level the place from 1,000 miles away, like your brother would have done. It means you aren't afraid of getting your hands dirty, unlike your sister. They spent their entire lives trying to impress me so they could get my money. You spent yours telling me the truth, even when it cost you everything. You thought I didn't notice. I noticed everything. The estate above ground is a trap. The commercial real estate portfolio is over-leveraged, packed with hidden tax liabilities that will surface within 18 months. Margot's trust is tied to assets already under federal audit. Sterling will spend the next decade fighting off creditors. Margot will drain her accounts on legal fees before she understands what happened. They wanted the appearance of wealth. I gave them the illusion of it. This room is reality. Gold, silver, cash. Approximately $10.4 million based on current spot prices. No digital records, no banking trail. It is yours. Legally, irrevocably yours. But read the journal in the desk drawer before you decide how to use it. I have a debt that was never paid in Bitter Creek. You will understand. Do not flaunt this. Do not tell them. Build something real. Grandpa Edmund. Wren read the letter twice. The second time, her hands trembled so badly, the paper shook, the words blurring as her vision swam. She folded it carefully, slid it into the breast pocket of her jacket against her chest, where she could feel the stiff paper through the fabric. She looked around the glowing, silent room. The gold on the shelves seemed to bend the gravity of the air around it, dense, patient, waiting. The cash in the pelican cases sat in perfect rows, each bundle a compressed rectangle of possibility she had never in her life imagined holding, let alone owning. The silver towers caught the warm LED light along their edges, glinting like the surface of a frozen lake at dawn. She didn't scream, she didn't jump, she didn't laugh or pound the walls or call anyone. There was no one to call. Wren sank to the cold concrete floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, pressed her forehead against the rough denim over her kneecaps. She let out a long, ragged breath that came from somewhere below her lungs, below her ribs, from a place she had spent her entire adult life keeping sealed. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was relief, deep, bone-crushing, tectonic relief. The constant pressure of living paycheck to paycheck. The suffocating arithmetic of choosing between a car repair, a dental visit, a winter coat. The quiet humiliation of wearing discount shoes in Margot's marble foyer, of parking the taped-together Subaru next to Sterling's leased Porsche, of smiling through holiday dinners where her contributions were tolerated with a benign condescension reserved for charity cases who happened to share your last name. All of it, every grinding, exhausting ounce of it evaporated. Not slowly, not in stages, but all at once, like a pressure valve releasing decades of accumulated weight into the sterile air of a room no one in the world knew she was sitting in. She stayed on that floor for a long time. The dehumidifiers hummed, the LEDs glowed, the gold sat on its shelves, indifferent to its own value, waiting for whatever came next. Eventually, Wren stood. Her legs were stiff. Her face was dry. She hadn't cried. Not quite, though she had come closer than she had in years. She walked to the folding table, opened the single drawer beneath it. Inside was a leather-bound journal, thick, its cover cracked with age, closed with a leather strap. She picked it up. It was heavy in her hands, not from the weight of the paper, but from the weight of what she already suspected it contained. She didn't open it. Not yet. Not down here in this tomb of metal, in the blue-white silence of filtered air. She needed sky above her, even if that sky was gray. She tucked the journal under her arm, climbed the steel stairs, stepped back into the cabin, into the cold, into the smell of rot, into the world above. She lowered the steel plate back into place, covering the hatch, swept debris over it with her boot until it disappeared beneath sawdust, dirt, splinters of pine. That night, she sat in her sleeping bag on the deflated mattress, her back against the cabin wall, the portable stove casting a small circle of blue-orange light. Rain tapped against the roof in a steady, patient rhythm, finding the leaks, dripping through in thin silver threads that caught the stove's glow. She opened the journal. The first page was blank. The second bore a single line in Edmund's handwriting, smaller here, more private, as though these words were meant for a smaller audience than even one. The best foundations are the ones nobody sees. She turned to the third page. Dense, cramped writing filled both sides, dates, names, figures. She began to read. The entry started in 1979. They described a purchase, a lumber mill, a small town in the Cascade Mountains, a decision that would haunt the man who made it for the rest of his life. Wren read the first 3 pages. Her eyes widened. She looked up, through the cracked, grimy window, toward the dark valley where Bitter Creek sat invisible in the rain. Edmund hadn't just hidden his fortune here. He had buried his conscience. The cabin wasn't a gift, it was a confession. The money was real, but it came with a debt that no amount of gold could automatically erase, a debt owed to the very town she had driven through that morning, the town with the boarded storefronts, the peeling church, the one general store still holding on, the town Edmund Calloway had destroyed to build his empire. Wren closed the journal, held it against her chest. The rain continued its patient, relentless work on the roof above, finding every weakness, every crack, every place where the structure had failed. Below her, beneath the steel plate, beneath the concrete, the gold waited in its silent, climate-controlled vault. Above her, through miles of mountain forest, Opal Marsden was closing up her shop for the night, turning the same lock she had turned for 40 years, in a town that was slowly dying because a man she never named had taken its heartbeat for scrap. The brass key sat in Wren's pocket, heavy, tarnished, carrying 6 numbers that had opened a door to $10 million. But the journal in her arms held something heavier, the truth about where that money came from, who paid for it, what it cost beyond the price stamped on each gold bar. She pressed her back against the wall, pulled the sleeping bag tighter, closed her eyes. Sleep didn't come easily, but when it finally did, The last image in her mind was Opal's face behind the counter, those pale blue eyes watching her with the quiet, unblinking patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time for something she wasn't sure would ever arrive. Wren woke before dawn. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving behind a silence so complete it had weight. The way deep water has weight pressing against the walls of the cabin, filling every crack, every gap in the rotting wood. She lay still in the sleeping bag, her breath visible in the gray half-light, the journal resting on her chest where she had fallen asleep holding it. She sat up. Her muscles protested, shoulders stiff from 2 days of demolition work, lower back locked tight from sleeping on a deflated mattress on warped pine. She didn't reach for the butane stove. She didn't make coffee. She opened the journal to where she had stopped reading the night before, page 4, where Edmund's handwriting shifted from careful notation to something rawer, more urgent, the letters pressing deeper into the paper as though the pen itself was confessing. The entries were dated. They began in the spring of 1979. Edmund had arrived in Bitter Creek on a Tuesday in April. He was 31 years old, driving a pickup truck he had bought with cash from his first 3 salvage deals in the Sacramento Valley. The Bitter Creek Lumber Company was the only employer in a 60-mile radius, a mid-sized sawmill operation that processed Douglas fir, western red cedar, the old-growth timber that covered the Cascade slopes like a dark green blanket thrown over the shoulders of the mountains. 200 families depended on that mill. It was the heartbeat of the town, the reason the school stayed open, the reason the general store could keep its shelves stocked, the reason young people stayed instead of drifting toward Portland or Seattle looking for something better. The mill was struggling. Timber prices had dropped. Equipment was aging. The owner, a third-generation operator named Holt, was behind on payments to 3 different creditors. Edmund saw the numbers the way a surgeon sees an X-ray, not the patient, not the pain, just the fracture, the angle, the opportunity. He offered Holt a buyout at 40 cents on the dollar. Holt, exhausted, buried in debt, signed the papers on a Friday afternoon in the mill's front office, while sawdust drifted through the open windows like brown snow. Edmund didn't reopen the mill. He never intended to. Within 3 months, he had a crew dismantling every piece of industrial machinery in the building: the massive bandsaws, the debarking drums, the conveyor systems, the generators, the hydraulic log handlers. Everything made of steel, copper, brass, or aluminum was cataloged, weighed, loaded onto flatbed trucks. He sold the scrap to smelters in Tacoma, in Oakland, in a dozen industrial yards scattered along the West Coast. The profit margin was extraordinary. The raw materials inside that single failing sawmill generated enough capital to fund Edmund's next 5 acquisitions. He left Bitter Creek 3 months after he arrived. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. The numbers were clean. The transaction was legal. The fact that 200 families lost their only source of income, that the school board couldn't make payroll by September, that young couples packed their cars in the middle of the night because there was nothing left to stay, for none of that appeared on any balance sheet Edmund carried with him. The journal entries from 1979 ended abruptly, then nothing for almost 20 years. When the writing resumed, it was the late 1990s. The handwriting had changed. It was tighter, more controlled, but also more erratic. Words crossed out, sentences abandoned mid-thought, margins filled with numbers that didn't add up to anything except obsession. Edmund was wealthy by then. The Monterey mansion, the investment portfolio, the vintage car collection. He had everything the world recognized as success. He also had insomnia, a rotating pharmacy of medications he refused to take, a marriage that existed in name only, 2 grandchildren who visited with the regularity of quarterly earnings reports. He returned to Bitter Creek in 1998, not to buy anything, not to profit, just to look. The journal described the visits in spare, almost clinical language that somehow made them more devastating. He drove through Main Street on a Wednesday morning. Half the storefronts were boarded. The sawmill was a concrete foundation overgrown with blackberry vines. Its roof caved in, its walls long since scavenged by locals for building materials. The church steeple was intact, but the paint was peeling, the front steps cracked. The school had lost its gymnasium roof to a winter storm 3 years earlier. No one had the money to repair it. He parked across from Marsden's General, sat in his car for an hour, watched an old woman sweep the front porch with a broom that was more tape than bristle. He wrote, "I built my empire on the spine of this place. I took the bones out, sold them by the pound, left the body where it fell." He came back 6 more times over the following years, always alone, always in a rented car, never the Mercedes. He bought the Hemlock Ridge property in 2001, the half-acre lot, with the logging cabin that was already rotting when he signed the deed. He told no one, not Pemberton, not his family. He paid cash through a blind trust, the same method he used for every transaction he wanted, kept invisible. The cabin was never meant to be a home. It was a lookout, a place where he could sit on the sagging porch, stare down the valley toward the town he had gutted, measure the distance between what he had taken from it, what he could never give back. The vault came later, the decision to bury his fortune beneath the floor of the cabin, to convert liquid wealth into gold, silver, untraceable currency that came from a different impulse entirely. Paranoia about the banking system, yes. Distrust of digital records, certainly. But the location wasn't random. He chose to bury his treasure in the ground above the town he had stripped bare, as though the weight of that gold could somehow press his guilt into the earth deep enough to disappear. It couldn't. The journal made that clear. The final entries from the early 2000s were fragmented, urgent, increasingly self-aware. Edmund understood what he had done. He understood that no amount of hidden wealth could undo it. But he also understood something else, something that separated his final years from simple remorse. He wrote, "Guilt is useless if it only makes you feel worse. Guilt is only worth carrying if it makes someone else's life better." Wren closed the journal, set it on her lap. Through the cracked window, the morning light was turning the fog above the tree line a pale, luminous gray. Somewhere below, in the valley she couldn't see from this elevation, Bitter Creek was waking up. Opal was unlocking her front door. The old carpenter, whose name Wren didn't yet know, was probably on a ladder somewhere, nailing shingles onto a roof that wasn't his because no one else was going to do it. The money in the vault beneath her feet was real. The gold was real. The cash was real. But the journal had added a dimension she hadn't anticipated, a moral weight that transformed the fortune from a windfall into a question. Edmund hadn't just left her money. He had left her a choice. She tucked the journal into her bag, pulled on her boots, drove down the mountain. Marsden's General smelled the same pine cleaner, old cardboard coffee that had been on the burner since before sunrise. Opal stood behind the counter, pricing canned goods with a handheld sticker gun, each label pressed onto the tin with the precise, repetitive motion of a woman who had performed this task 10,000 times. She looked up when the bell above the door rang. Her hands paused. Wren walked to the counter. She didn't buy batteries this time. She didn't ask for directions. Her voice was quieter than she intended. "Tell me about the sawmill." Opal set the sticker gun down. She removed her reading glasses, folded them, placed them on the counter beside a stack of receipts. She held Wren's gaze for a long moment, not suspicious, not hostile, but searching, the way a person looks at a locked door they've been told might finally open. Opal's voice came out flat, stripped of inflection. "Man named Calloway bought the Bitter Creek Lumber Company in the spring of 1979. I was 28 years old. My husband, Gerald, worked the debarking line, 16 years on that floor. Knew every machine by the sound it made." She paused, not for effect. The pause was structural, a load-bearing wall in a sentence that needed reinforcement before it could hold the next one. 3 months after the sale, trucks showed up. They didn't bring lumber. They brought cutting torches. Dismantled every piece of equipment in the building. Band saws, conveyors, the lot. Loaded it on flatbeds, drove it out of town. Gerald stood in the parking lot watching them take apart the debarking drum, piece by piece, like butchering an animal. Her eyes didn't waver. Gerald drove to Portland looking for millwork, found some, never came back. Not because he couldn't, because something broke in him when he watched them cut that mill apart. The work wasn't the only thing Calloway took. Wren's throat tightened. She wanted to tell Opal the truth, that the man who bought the mill was her grandfather, that she was standing in this store because he had left her a rotting cabin full of secrets. But the words wouldn't form. Not yet. The distance between knowing the truth, speaking it aloud, was wider than she expected. Instead, she asked, "How many families left?" Opal picked up her glasses, put them back on, returned to pricing canned goods, each sticker pressed with slightly more force than before. Enough that the school went from 4 teachers to 1. Enough that the volunteer fire department lost half its crew. Enough that Sunday service went from standing room to empty pews. Sticker. Press. The ones who stayed did it because they had nowhere else to go, or because they loved this place too much to let it die without a witness. Wren left the store without buying anything. She sat in the Subaru for 15 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, engine off, staring at the faded sign above Marsden's door. The guilt Edmund had described in his journal, the weight he had carried for decades, she could feel it now. Not as an abstraction, not as words on a page, but as a physical presence sitting in the passenger seat beside her, breathing on the cracked window. She drove back to Portland that afternoon. The highway unspooled through the Cascade foothills like a gray ribbon pulled from a spool, the mountains receding in the rearview mirror until they were just a blue smudge on the horizon. By the time she reached her apartment, she had made 2 decisions. The first was practical. The second was not. The practical decision: she needed to convert the physical assets in the vault into usable, legal capital. Gold bars in an underground bunker were worth nothing if she couldn't move them into the financial system without triggering an investigation. She called Pemberton the next morning. His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who had spent 50 years navigating conversations where every word could become evidence. Her question was direct. "Did you know what was in the vault?" Pemberton was quiet for 3 seconds. "Edmund retained me under strict privilege. My instructions were to deliver the deed, the key, nothing more. He did not disclose the specific contents of the Hemlock Ridge property. What I understood was that the land itself held value beyond its assessed worth. The nature of that value he left for you to discover. But you verified the legality," he said so in his letter. "I verified that any physical assets found on property legally deeded to you through instruments executed prior to his death are your sole possession under both state property law, the terms of the irrevocable trust he established." A pause. Edmund anticipated the need for verification long before you or I understood what he was verifying. Pemberton referred her to a financial specialist, a woman named Grace Whitfield, based in Seattle, who worked with high-net-worth individuals transitioning inherited assets into managed portfolios. Whitfield was discreet, expensive, meticulous. She didn't ask where the gold came from. She asked how quickly Wren needed it converted, what tax structure she preferred, whether she wanted the proceeds routed through a trust, an LLC, or a direct holding account. The plan was conservative by design. Small lots of gold sold through licensed precious metal dealers across 3 states: Oregon, Washington, Nevada. Each transaction structured below the mandatory reporting threshold, but every dollar declared on Wren's tax filings. Whitfield was emphatic about that point. Her voice carried the sharp clarity of someone who had seen fortunes destroyed by shortcuts. "The IRS doesn't care how you got it. They care whether you reported it. Report everything. Pay the taxes. Sleep at night." Wren started with the silver. It was less conspicuous, easier to transport, simpler to explain. She loaded 1,200-ounce bars into the trunk of the Subaru wrapped in moving blankets, packed in cardboard boxes labeled kitchen supplies. Drove 4 hours to a dealer in Seattle's industrial district. The first 2 sales went smoothly. Small quantities. Professional transactions. The dealer weighed the bars, tested purity, wrote a check. Wren deposited the checks through a business account Whitfield had set up under a holding entity. Clean, methodical, invisible. The 3rd sale went wrong. Month 3. A different dealer recommended by the first. Larger lot, 8 bars, roughly $60,000. The dealer was younger, sharper, more curious. He weighed the silver, ran the purity test, then leaned back in his chair behind a desk cluttered with assay reports. His questions came in a steady conversational rhythm that felt rehearsed. "Nice lot." "Estate sale?" Wren nodded. "Recent?" She hesitated a beat too long. "Family member pass away?" Her answer came out stiff. My grandfather, sorry for your loss. He was a collector? Something like that. Where'd he store them? Safe deposit box. She fumbled. A private vault. Commercial vault? Which facility? She couldn't answer that. The dealer's expression didn't change, but his hand moved to a notepad beside his keyboard. He wrote something down, her name, probably. The date, the details of the transaction. He completed the sale, handed her a check. But Wren's hands were trembling as she folded it into her pocket. She walked out of the shop into the Seattle rain, stood on the sidewalk, felt the cold water running down her collar. She was a hardware store manager. She knew how to inventory socket wrenches, negotiate bulk pricing on drywall screws, manage a staff of 11 people who called in sick on Mondays. She did not know how to sit across from a stranger, maintain a fabricated calm while discussing the provenance of $60,000 in precious metal. She was out of her depth. The vault was real. The wealth was real. But the world between that wealth, its conversion into something she could actually use, that world operated on a set of skills she had never learned, in a language she barely spoke. That night in her apartment, she opened the journal again, flipped to a section she hadn't read, entries from the early 2000s, after Edmund had built the vault, after he had begun the slow, methodical process of converting his digital holdings into physical metal. One entry, dated March 2004, was circled in red ink. Money is never dangerous. Haste is what kills you. Wren stared at the sentence. Read it again. Closed the journal. She called Whitfield the next morning, told her about the dealer's questions. Whitfield didn't panic. She adjusted the plan: smaller lots, wider geographic spread, longer intervals between sales. She also suggested something else. Stop selling silver entirely for 60 days. Let the trail go cold. Let the dealer forget Wren's face before the next transaction created another data point for anyone who might be looking. Wren waited. She returned to her job at the hardware store, stocked shelves, ran the register, smiled at customers who had no idea that the woman counting out their change in nickels was sitting on a fortune buried under a mountain 4 hours east. During those 60 days, she drove to Bitter Creek 3 times. Each visit, the excuse was the same: working on the cabin, patching the roof, clearing debris. The excuse was also true. She did work on the cabin. She sealed the worst of the roof leaks with tar paper, replaced 2 of the collapsed porch boards with lumber she hauled up in the Subaru's back seat, swept out the mouse nests, scrubbed decades of grime from the surviving window. The cabin would never be beautiful, but it was beginning to look like something a person might choose to enter rather than flee from. But the real work happened in town. Each visit she spent longer at Marsden's General. Opal warmed to her gradually, not with declarations or sudden intimacy, but with the slow, incremental trust of someone who had learned to measure people by what they did rather than what they claimed. Opal poured her coffee without being asked, offered her a stool behind the counter when the morning rush 3 customers on a good day was over, told her about the town in fragments, the way old-growth trees drop their branches one at a time, season by season, until the shape of the whole becomes visible. Wren met Wallace Greer, the carpenter. He was 73, wiry, quiet, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same oak he spent his days shaping. He was single-handedly restoring the church steeple, replacing rotted clapboard with salvaged cedar, 1 plank at a time, working from a homemade scaffold that would have given an OSHA inspector a heart attack. Nobody was paying him. He did it because it needed doing, because the alternative was watching the steeple collapse, because in a town where everything was slowly falling apart, keeping one thing standing felt like an act of defiance against the slow erosion of neglect. She met Ruth Halford, the school teacher, 58, patient, perpetually tired, teaching 8 children between the ages of 6 through 14 in a single classroom that doubled as the town's community center on weekday evenings. The gymnasium roof had never been replaced after the storm. Ruth held classes in the main building, arranging desks in a semicircle, differentiating lessons across 5 grade levels simultaneously, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had stopped waiting for reinforcements that were never coming. She met Dale Pruitt, who ran the gas station, delivered mail 3 days a week, served as the volunteer fire chief. He was 45, the youngest permanent resident by a decade. His wife had left for Spokane 2 years ago. He stayed because his father was buried in the cemetery behind the church, because Dale Pruitt did not leave things he had committed to, even when those things stopped making sense. The town was dying. Not dramatically, no flood, no fire, no single catastrophic event. It was dying the way a candle dies in a room with no air. Slowly, invisibly, one family leaving per year, one more house going dark, one more seat empty at Ruth's classroom semicircle. The subtraction was simple, patient, merciless. -1, then -1 again. Keep subtracting until the number reaches 0. Wren began to see Bitter Creek differently. During her first visit, it had been a waypoint, the last outpost of civilization before the logging road swallowed her into the mountains. Now it was something else. It was the crime scene. The place where Edmund's fortune was born, where 200 families paid the price for one man's ability to see steel instead of people. It was also, she realized, the place Edmund had sent her not just to find the gold, but to find the debt the gold was supposed to repay. She sat on the porch of the cabin one evening, the journal open on her knees, reading entries from the last year of Edmund's life. His handwriting had deteriorated badly, the once forceful script reduced to a wavering scrawl, each word costing visible effort. But the final entries were the clearest in the entire journal, as though the approaching end had focused his thoughts into a beam of concentrated intention. He wrote about Wren, not by name at first, just the middle one. The granddaughter who didn't bring whiskey, the one who looked him in the eye, told him to take his medication, didn't flinch when he glared at her. The one who, alone among his descendants, treated him like a human being instead of a bank account with a heartbeat. She is the only one who ever told me the truth, he wrote. That makes her the only one I trust with this. Month 6 arrived. Whitfield had successfully converted approximately $2 million in precious metals into legitimate, taxed, documented capital. The process had been slow, deliberate, invisible, exactly as designed. Wren opened a business account under Iron Ridge Holdings, the LLC she had formed through a corporate attorney Whitfield recommended. The name was deliberate. Iron for the metal that started Edmund's empire. Ridge for the land where he buried its proceeds. She began researching Sterling's inheritance. It didn't take long to confirm what Edmund had predicted in his letter. The commercial real estate portfolio was a disaster wrapped in a leather briefcase. 3 of the properties carried structural violation lawsuits dating back years, deferred maintenance claims from tenants who had been ignored so long they hired attorneys. The holding company, Calloway Industrial Partners, was leveraged against projected rental income that had evaporated when 2 anchor tenants defaulted on their leases. Property taxes were delinquent in 2 counties. Sterling was servicing the debt with cash from a line of credit that was itself secured against assets already pledged as collateral for separate obligations of financial architecture built on promises made to cover other promises, the kind of structure that collapses not gradually but all at once when the first domino tips. Margot's situation was different in texture but identical in trajectory. The family trust Edmund left her was substantial on paper liquid assets, investment accounts, a diversified portfolio managed by a firm in San Francisco. But the trust was under federal audit. An IRS review, triggered 18 months ago, had frozen the primary accounts pending resolution of questions about unreported capital gains from transactions Edmund had structured during his final years. Margot's legal fees were mounting. Her lifestyle, the Monterey estate, the wardrobe, the travel. The maintenance of an image calibrated to suggest effortless wealth was consuming cash at a rate that assumed unlimited supply. The supply was not unlimited. It was shrinking faster than she wanted to admit. Edmund had engineered this. The journal made it clear. He hadn't simply divided his estate unevenly, he had weaponized the division. He gave Margot the appearance of wealth attached to a ticking audit. He gave Sterling the architecture of a business empire built on hidden liabilities. He gave Wren a rotting cabin with $10 million underneath it. The surface inheritance was a test of character. The real inheritance was a test of conscience. Wren sat in a corporate attorney's office in downtown Portland. The room was modest, no mahogany table, no polished surfaces, just functional furniture, fluorescent lighting, a window overlooking a parking structure. The attorney placed 3 documents on the desk: articles of incorporation for Iron Ridge Holdings, an operating agreement, a resolution authorizing the LLC to acquire distressed commercial assets. Wren picked up the pen. It was heavier than she expected, not physically but conceptually. Everything she had been for 36 years was defined by limitation, limited income, limited influence, limited visibility in a family that measured worth by portfolio size. Signing these papers wouldn't change who she was, but it would change what she could do. She signed. Her handwriting was steady. Her hand did not tremble. The attorney notarized the documents, filed them electronically, handed her a folder containing her copies. She walked out of the building into the Portland rain, stood on the sidewalk, felt the water on her face. She wasn't the scraps anymore. She wasn't the punchline. She was a player at the table, holding cards no one knew she had, in a game her grandfather had designed from the grave. The first call from Sterling came on a Thursday in October, 10 months after the reading of the will. Wren was at the hardware store, restocking a display of exterior wood stain in the seasonal aisle. Her phone buzzed in her back pocket. She recognized the number, Sterling's personal cell. He hadn't called her in over a year. He hadn't texted. He hadn't acknowledged her existence since the day he offered demolition money in Pemberton's office. She stepped into the stockroom, answered. Sterling's voice was different. The confident, clipped cadence was gone. What replaced it was tighter, more controlled. The voice of a man working very hard to project authority he no longer possessed. I need to ask you something, Wren. I'm going to be direct. She waited. I hired a forensic accountant to trace Edmund's liquidated holdings, the ones that disappeared before his death. Roughly $8 million in precious metals, precious stones, currency, unaccounted for. A pause. My investigator also ran a background check on you. Routine. Nothing personal. She felt her pulse climb but kept her breathing level. You opened a business account in Portland 4 months ago, an LLC called Iron Ridge Holdings. You deposited 6 figures into that account within the first 60 days. Your salary at the hardware store is $43,000 a year. Another pause. Longer, heavier. I'm not stupid, Wren. Her silence was its own answer. Sterling's voice dropped, losing the veneer of composure. The old man buried it. Somewhere on that property you found it. Wren stared at a shelf of galvanized deck screws. Each box was labeled by size, arranged in ascending order. She had organized this shelf herself, last Tuesday. The order was precise, logical, comforting. Nothing about the conversation she was having belonged in the same universe as galvanized deck screws. Sterling continued, the control in his voice cracking at the edges. Whatever you found on that land is part of the Calloway estate. It doesn't matter whose name is on the deed. Assets concealed by a succedent prior to probate are subject to redistribution under state law. My attorney will be filing a petition with the probate court on Monday. The line went dead. Wren lowered the phone. Her hand was steady, but something behind her ribs was vibrating a high, tight frequency, the internal hum of a system under sudden, extreme load. 10 months of careful, methodical work. The slow conversion of gold into capital, the formation of the LLC, the research into Sterling's collapsing portfolio. All of it visible now, exposed because a forensic accountant had followed a money trail that Wren hadn't hidden well enough. She had been careful. She had been thorough. She had not been invisible. Within a week, Sterling retained Garrett Sable. Wren had never heard the name, but Pemberton had. His reaction, over the phone, was measured in a way that communicated alarm more effectively than panic would have. Sable specializes in contested estate litigation. He's expensive, aggressive, effective. He's won cases where the legal foundation was significantly weaker than what Sterling is bringing. Sable filed the petition on Monday as promised. The argument was precise, well-constructed, dangerous. Any assets of material value discovered on property that was part of the Calloway estate at the time of Edmund's death, regardless of individual deed assignment, constituted undisclosed estate property subject to equitable redistribution among all named beneficiaries. The petition requested an emergency injunction to freeze Iron Ridge Holdings accounts pending a full forensic audit. Wren read the filing in Pemberton's office. Each paragraph was a controlled demolition charge placed at the foundation of everything she had built. If Sable won the injunction, her accounts would be frozen. If the audit proceeded, The full scope of the vault's contents would become a matter of public record. If the court agreed with Sable's interpretation of estate law, the gold, all of it, would be divided 3 ways. Margot would get a third. Sterling would get a third. The poetic justice Edmund had engineered from beyond the grave would be dismantled by the same legal system he had spent his life distrusting. Pemberton sat across from her. His expression was carefully neutral, the professional mask of a man who had spent 5 decades delivering unwelcome information without editorializing. But his hands folded on the desk were pressed together tightly enough to whiten the knuckles. Wren's voice came out steady, though something beneath it was fraying. Can he win? Pemberton chose his words with surgical care. The argument has legal merit. Sable is correct that undisclosed assets of a decedent can be challenged in probate, even after the initial distribution. The question is whether the deed to Hemlock Ridge, combined with the specific language in Edmund's will, constitutes a clear enough separation to survive a judicial challenge. He paused. It's a close case, Wren. I won't pretend otherwise. She drove to Bitter Creek that night, 4 hours through darkness, through mountain roads she now knew by feel, rather than by the printed directions she had thrown away months ago. She parked at the cabin, didn't go inside, sat on the new porch board she had installed herself, pressure-treated lumber from her own store, cut to length in the back lot during her lunch break, hauled up the mountain in the back seat of the Subaru. The night was clear, no rain for once, stars visible through gaps in the canopy, pinpricks of cold light in a sky so dark it looked solid. Below, invisible in the valley, Bitter Creek slept. Opal's store was dark. Wallace's scaffold leaned against the church steeple like a skeleton embracing a monument. Ruth's classroom was empty, the desks arranged in their patient semicircle, waiting for morning. Wren sat on the porch of a cabin that contained beneath its repaired floor enough gold to change the trajectory of her life forever. She also sat above a town that her grandfather had destroyed to build the fortune that produced that gold. The two facts were inseparable. They had always been inseparable. Edmund had made sure of that. For the first time since she opened the vault, she was afraid. Not of poverty. She had lived with poverty her entire adult life, knew its rhythms, its humiliations, its particular shade of gray. She was afraid of losing something she hadn't known she wanted until she held it, the chance to do something Edmund never could, the chance to make it right. Sterling had the legal machinery. Sable had the expertise. The probate court had the authority. Wren had $10 million in a hole in the ground, an LLC with a frozen future, a hardware store salary, a journal full of a dead man's regrets. She pulled the journal from her bag. She had read most of it, the early entries, the middle years, the passages about Bitter Creek, the slow accumulation of guilt that had driven Edmund from accumulation towards something harder to name. But the final pages, the last dozen or so, she had skipped. They were written in the wavering, barely legible script of a man whose hands were failing, whose time was measured in weeks rather than months. She had avoided them because reading a dying man's last words felt like standing at a threshold she wasn't ready to cross. She crossed it now. The final entry was dated 11 days before Edmund's death. The writing was so unsteady it took Wren several minutes to decipher each line, tilting the page under her flashlight beam, tracing the shapes of letters that had lost their architecture. If they come for it, Sterling will. Eventually. He has the instinct but not the patience, so it will take him a while. Do not panic. I have prepared for this. I was not a good man for most of my life, but I was always a thorough one. Ask Pemberton about the second envelope. He was instructed to hold it in escrow, sealed until a legal challenge was filed against the Hemlock Ridge property or any assets associated with it. He will not open it without cause. When the cause arrives, so will the answer. Trust the process, Wren. I built the walls before I filled the room. The foundation holds. Wren read the passage 3 times, the second envelope. Pemberton had never mentioned a second envelope. In every conversation, the will reading, the phone calls about the deed, the discussions about tax strategy, he had presented himself as a man operating at the boundary of his instructions, delivering only what Edmund had authorized him to deliver. But Edmund had given him something else, a contingency, a sealed document held in escrow, activated only by the specific trigger of a legal challenge. Wren closed the journal, pressed it against her chest. The brass key sat in her jacket pocket, its weight familiar now, almost comforting. The 6 numbers on its face, no longer a mystery but a reminder. Edmund had thought of everything. He had anticipated Sterling's greed, Sable's legal strategy, the probate court's jurisdiction. He had built the defense before the attack existed, laid the foundation before the walls went up, solved the problem before anyone knew there was a problem to solve. She sat on the porch, in the dark, in the cold, in the vast silence of the Cascade Mountains, holding a dead man's journal against her heart. Below her, the vault waited with its quiet cargo of gold. Above her, the stars burned in their ancient, indifferent patterns. Somewhere in Portland, Sterling was drinking scotch in a half-empty apartment, rehearsing victory speeches for a war he didn't realize he had already lost. Somewhere in Monterey, Margaux was calculating how much of her grandmother's jewelry she could sell before anyone noticed. Wren didn't know what was in the second envelope. She didn't know if it would be enough. But she knew something they didn't, something Edmund had encoded into every page of the journal, every number on the brass key, every bar of gold stacked in that silent, climate-controlled room beneath the rotting floor of a cabin nobody wanted. The people who build on foundations no one can see are the ones who never fall. She pulled out her phone. The signal was weak, 1 bar, flickering. She typed a text to Pemberton. 7 words, "I need to see the second envelope." She hit send, watched the progress bar crawl. The message went through. She put the phone in her pocket, pulled her coat tighter, looked out at the dark wall of Douglas firs, at the stars above the ridge, at the town sleeping below the town that had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to arrive with both the means to rebuild, the reason to try. The brass key pressed against her thigh through the denim. The journal rested in her lap. The night was cold, clear, still. Everything was about to change, but not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, Wren sat with the weight of everything she knew, everything she feared, everything she intended. She let the silence hold it all. Tomorrow she would call Pemberton. Tomorrow the second envelope. Tomorrow the next move in a game designed by a dead man who had spent his final years building a chessboard he would never sit at, placing pieces he would never move, trusting the one person who had never tried to impress him to finish the work he couldn't. Pemberton's office looked different at 7 in the morning. The overhead lights were off. Gray autumn light filtered through the blinds in thin horizontal bars, striping the carpet, the bookshelves, the old man's face as he sat behind his desk, with his hands folded over a manila envelope that had not been opened in 4 years. Wren sat across from him. She hadn't slept. She had driven from Bitter Creek to Portland through the pre-dawn darkness, the Cascade Highway empty except for logging trucks running their first loads of the day, their headlights cutting through fog so thick the beams seemed to stop mid-air, hitting a wall of white moisture that refused to part. She set the journal on the desk between them. Pemberton looked at it but didn't touch it. Her voice was hoarse from the cold, the sleeplessness, the 4-hour drive. "He told me to ask you about a second envelope." Pemberton didn't move for a long moment. His hands remained on the manila envelope beneath them, pressing down with a pressure that seemed deliberate, as though he was physically preventing the document from rising on its own. His voice, when it came, carried the measured cadence of a man selecting each word from a private inventory. "Edmund retained me under a dual instruction. The first was the delivery of the deed, the folder I gave you at the reading. That instruction was unconditional. The second was conditional. He provided a sealed envelope to be held in my firm's escrow vault, unopened until a specific trigger occurred." Wren leaned forward. "What trigger?" "Any legal challenge filed in any court by any party against the ownership of the Hemlock Ridge property or any assets associated with it." He removed his glasses. Without them, his face looked older, more exposed. "Garrett Sable filed that challenge 9 days ago. The trigger has been met." He lifted his hands from the envelope. It was heavy cream stock, the kind used for formal legal instruments, sealed with red wax that bore no insignia, just a smooth, pressed circle, unbroken. Edmund's name was written across the front in the same forceful penmanship. Wren now recognized the way she recognized her own heartbeat. Pemberton slid a brass letter opener across the desk. Wren picked it up. The weight of it reminded her of the key, the same density, the same cold deliberateness of metal shaped for a single purpose. She broke the wax seal. The envelope opened along a clean, precise fold. Inside was a single document, 12 pages, bound with a blue legal backing. She pulled it out. The cover page read, "Irrevocable Inter Vivos Trust Hemlock Ridge Asset Designation." Below that, a date from 4 years before Edmund's death. Below that, the signatures of Edmund Calloway, 2 witnesses she didn't recognize, a notary stamp from Monterey County. Pemberton spoke while she read, his voice low, clinical. "An irrevocable trust, once executed, cannot be modified, revoked, or challenged by any party including the grantor. It operates outside the probate process entirely. This trust designates that all physical assets, tangible property of any kind located on, within, or beneath the Hemlock Ridge tract are the sole, exclusive property of Wren Calloway, not as part of the Calloway estate, not subject to equitable redistribution, separate, absolute, pre-existing." Wren turned to the operative clause on page 6. The language was dense, layered with the precise redundancy of legal drafting, every possible angle of attack anticipated, every loophole preemptively sealed. She wasn't a lawyer, but she understood the architecture. Edmund had built this document the way he built everything, with the obsessive thoroughness of a man who assumed the world trying to take from him, who defended his positions with walls inside walls inside walls. The trust had been signed 4 years before his death, before the will, before the division of the estate, before Margot received her frozen trust, before Sterling received his collapsing portfolio. Edmund had removed the Hemlock Ridge assets from the game before the game even started. By the time Pemberton read the will in that polished conference room, the gold, the silver, the cash beneath the cabin floor already belonged to Wren, had belonged to her for years through an instrument no probate court could touch. Pemberton replaced his glasses. His expression carried something she hadn't seen before, not satisfaction, not relief, but something closer to the expression of an engineer watching a bridge hold under a load it was designed for decades ago. His voice was quiet. Edmund was not a good man for most of his life, but he was without question the most thorough client I have ever served. Wren held the document in both hands. 12 pages, blue backing, a notary stamp from a county office where a clerk had pressed an ink seal onto paper without knowing she was certifying the transfer of $10 million. The weight of the pages felt different from the weight of the journal, less personal, more structural. The journal was Edmund's conscience. This document was his final move. She looked up at Pemberton. "Sterling's attorney, Sable, how do we deliver this?" Pemberton reached for his phone. "I'll file a responsive motion with the probate court this afternoon. Sable will receive a copy by courier before close of business. The trust predates the will, predates the estate filing, predates the probate jurisdiction entirely. His petition becomes moot on receipt." 2 days later, Garrett Sable sat in his own office in downtown Seattle, reading 12 pages of irrevocable trust language for the 3rd time. He was a careful man, methodical, experienced, not given to emotional reactions, but by the second reading his legal pad was blank. He had found no crack, no seam, no procedural vulnerability. The document was airtight. Edmund Calloway had paid a team of estate planning specialists, the best in California, based on the law firm letterhead embedded in the trust recitals, to construct a legal instrument that anticipated every conceivable challenge. Sable picked up his phone. Sterling answered on the first ring. Sable's voice was measured, devoid of inflection. "The trust is bulletproof. It was executed 4 years prior to your grandfather's death, properly witnessed, notarized, filed with the county recorder's office in Monterey. It designates all tangible assets on the Hemlock Ridge property as your sister's sole possession, outside the estate, outside probate jurisdiction. If you proceed with the petition, you will lose. You will also be liable for opposing counsel's legal fees under the applicable statute." The sound that came through the phone was not language. It was something more primitive, the compressed fury of a man watching the last exit close in front of him. Sterling's voice cracked through the receiver, raw, uncontrolled, stripped of every layer of corporate polish. "That money belongs to the family. He hid it. He lied about it. She has no right." Sable interrupted with the flat finality of a man who had already moved on. "She has every legal right. The trust is valid. My recommendation is to withdraw the petition before the court awards fees." I'll send my final invoice by the end of the week." The line went silent. Sable set his phone on his desk, closed his legal pad, returned Edmund Calloway's irrevocable trust to its envelope. He had billed $47,000 on the case. He felt nothing about the outcome. Outcomes were not his department. Billing was. Wren received the court notification 3 days later. Petition withdrawn. No injunction. No freeze. No audit. Iron Ridge Holdings accounts were released. The probate court's file on the matter was closed with a single-line notation. Respondent's motion granted. Petition dismissed without prejudice. She sat in her apartment, holding the notification, reading the single line over again. Dismissed without prejudice. 3 words that meant Sterling could theoretically refile but wouldn't. Sable had told him the walls were too high. The door was locked from the inside by a man who had spent his final years ensuring that the one person he trusted would never be forced to give back what he'd given her. The relief didn't crash over her this time. It arrived slowly, like the tide coming in each wave reaching slightly further up the shore than the last, each one carrying away a thin layer of the tension she had been holding in her chest for weeks. She breathed. She sat still. She let the tide do its work. Months passed after the petition collapsed. Wren continued converting the remaining gold through Whitfield's network. Smaller lots, wider spread, the patient discipline of a woman who had internalized Edmund's warning about haste. She returned to the hardware store, resumed the routine of her visible life, while the invisible one grew quietly beneath it. The forensic accountant Sterling had hired moved on to other cases. Sable sent his final invoice, closed his file, forgot the name Calloway, the way busy professionals forget the details of concluded matters. The legal threat dissolved the way storm clouds dissolve after a front passes, not with a dramatic clearing, but with a slow, quiet dilution of pressure, until the sky simply looked different. It wasn't until late winter, 4 months after Sable withdrew, that Wren finally opened the journal to its last remaining pages. She had been circling them for weeks, the way you circle a door you know leads somewhere you need to go, but aren't certain you want to arrive. The pages were near the back, written in the trembling, nearly illegible script of Edmund's final months. The ink was lighter here, as though even the pen was running out of time. She turned to the first of these pages. In 2015, I used a blind trust administered by a firm in Sacramento with no connection to the Calloway name to acquire 14 parcels of real property in the township of Bitter Creek, Oregon. Wren's breath caught. She kept reading. The parcels include the former Bitter Creek Lumber Company site, Lot 14, Block 2, the 5 derelict commercial buildings on Main Street between 1st Avenue, 3rd Avenue, the lot formerly occupied by the elementary school gymnasium, 3 residential parcels on Spruce Lane, the parcel containing the defunct community water treatment facility, the vacant lot adjacent to the Marsden General Store. No one in Bitter Creek knows the buyer's identity. The purchases were made through intermediaries. The properties have been held dormant, taxes paid, insurance maintained, but no development, no contact with local officials, no visible ownership presence. I did not buy these properties to profit from them. I have enough money. Too much. I bought them because they are the places I destroyed, the mill where I stripped the machinery, the stores that closed because the mill workers left, the school that lost its roof because the tax base evaporated, the water system that was never upgraded because the town could no longer afford the bond payments. I cannot undo what I did in 1979. I cannot bring back Gerald Marsden or the other men who left. I cannot restore the years this town lost. But I can give someone the tools to try. The deeds to these 14 parcels are in a lockbox in the bottom drawer of the table in the vault. The lockbox key is taped to the underside of the table. If you have read this far, you already know what I am asking. Do not build to be seen. Build because it is right. Wren closed the journal. The apartment was silent. The afternoon light had shifted, the sun moving behind the building across the street, throwing the room into a muted gray that softened every edge, every surface, every sharp corner of the life she had been living before a brass key opened a steel door beneath a rotting floor. 14 parcels, the bones of an entire town, purchased in secret by the man who had broken it, held in trust by a system of intermediaries designed to ensure that the act of restitution would be invisible until the right person was ready to make it visible. Edmund hadn't just left her money. He hadn't just left her a legal shield. He had left her an entire town to rebuild a project so large, so morally weighted, so deeply entangled with the history of his own worst decisions that it could only be entrusted who would approach it not as an investment, but as an obligation. Not as a business opportunity, but as a debt. She drove to Bitter Creek the next morning. The late winter light in the Cascades was different from the gray mist of her first visit, sharper, colder. The sky a pale blue scraped clean by wind off the ridgeline. The Douglas firs held their green through the season, but the deciduous trees along the creek, the alders, the maples, the wild cherry were still bare, their branches dark against the sky like cracks in porcelain. She went to the cabin first. Down the stairs, into the vault. The gold on the shelves had diminished. Roughly $2 million worth had been converted through Whitfield's careful, methodical process over the past 14 months. The remaining bars sat in their rows, patient, indifferent, awaiting their transformation from inert metal into something with motion, with purpose. She knelt beside the folding table, reached beneath, felt along the underside of the steel surface until her fingers found a strip of packing tape. She peeled it away. A small brass key smaller than the one that had opened the cabin door, more delicate, the kind that fit a cash box or a portable safe, dropped into her palm. The bottom drawer of the table. She had opened the top drawer months ago, found the journal. She hadn't checked the bottom. It was deeper, heavier, sealed with a simple brass lock that yielded to the small key with a clean, satisfying click. Inside a steel lockbox, fireproof, waterproof. She lifted it out, opened it on the table beside the remaining stacks of gold. 14 property deeds, each one typed on heavy legal paper, each bearing the seal of the Bitter Creek County Recorder's Office, each transferring ownership from a blind trust in Sacramento to a secondary holding entity that she checked the registration was itself a subsidiary of the same irrevocable trust Pemberton had just used to defeat Sable's petition. Edmund had woven everything together. The gold, the land, the legal protections, all threaded through the same instrument, all leading to the same person, all activated by the same sequence of events. Wren spread the deeds across the table. 14 pieces of paper, 14 parcels of land, the sawmill site, 5 storefronts on Main Street, the school lot, 3 houses on Spruce Lane, the water treatment facility, the lot next to Marsden's General. She stacked them neatly, placed them back in the lockbox, carried the lockbox up the stairs, through the cabin, out into the cold mountain air. She sat on the porch she had repaired with her own hands, pressure-treated lumber, galvanized screws, each board measured, cut, leveled. The porch held her weight without complaint. No sag, no groan. A solid platform built over a rotten foundation that had been torn out, replaced, rebuilt from the joists up. Wren looked down the valley toward Bitter Creek. She couldn't see the town from here. The terrain dropped too steeply, the trees too dense, but she knew it was there. Opal's store, Wallace's church, Ruth's classroom, Dale's gas station, the boarded storefronts, the peeling paint, the empty houses, the slow subtraction that took one family per year. With the patience of erosion, she had 2 paths forward. The first was clean, efficient, self-serving. Use the remaining gold to fund the buyout of Sterling's collapsing portfolio, acquire Margot's frozen trust at a discount, consolidate the Calloway empire under Iron Ridge Holdings, live comfortably for the rest of her life. Nobody would blame her. Nobody would even know about the 14 deeds in the lockbox. Bitter Creek would continue its slow, invisible death. One more small American town lost to the flow of capital toward opportunity, away from obligation. The second path was harder, messier, more expensive. It meant splitting the remaining funds enough for the buyout, yes, but also enough to begin the work Edmund had envisioned but never started. Rebuilding the mill site into something usable, reopening the storefronts, repairing the school, upgrading the water system, creating reasons for people to stay or to come back. It meant telling Opal the truth. It meant standing in front of a woman whose husband had been driven away by Edmund's decisions, admitting that she was Edmund's granddaughter, that the money she was offering to rebuild the town had been generated by the same act of destruction that had broken it. The decision should have been agonizing. It wasn't. It was heavy, the weight of it pressed against her sternum like a physical object, but the direction was clear. It had been clear since the moment she read the first page of the journal, since the moment she saw the photograph of young Edmund smiling in front of a mill he was about to dismantle. Guilt is useless if it only makes you feel worse. Guilt is only worth carrying if it makes someone else's life better. Edmund's words, Edmund's debt, Wren's hands. 3 weeks later, she drove to Marsden's General on a Tuesday morning. The brass bell above the door rang its familiar tired note. Opal stood behind the counter, pricing canned tomatoes with the sticker gun, each label pressed with the mechanical precision of a ritual performed beyond the point of conscious thought. Wren didn't sit on the stool. She stood at the counter. She placed the journal on the surface between them, the cracked leather cover, the strap, the pages filled with a dead man's handwriting. Opal looked at the journal, then at Wren. Something behind her eyes shifted, not surprise, but recognition. Not of Wren's face, of the object on the counter, the leather, the size, the age of it. Wren's throat was dry. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "My name is Wren Calloway. Edmund Calloway was my grandfather. He left me the cabin on Hemlock Ridge. He also left me this." Opal's hands stopped moving. The sticker gun rested on the counter beside a row of canned tomatoes, each one perfectly labeled, each one aligned. She didn't speak. She didn't move. The silence between them was structural, holding up the weight of 45 years of cause, effect, consequence. Wren continued. She told Opal everything. The vault, the gold, the letter, the journal entries describing the purchase of the mill, the dismantling, the departure, the return visits in the late 90s, the blind trust purchases of 14 parcels, the irrevocable trust, the second envelope. She held nothing back. When she finished, the store was quiet. The refrigerator in the back hummed. A truck passed on the road outside, its engine fading into the distance, until there was nothing left but the hum, the silence. The two women standing on opposite sides of a counter that suddenly felt like a border crossing between two versions of the same history. Opal removed her reading glasses, folded them with both hands, set them on the counter beside the sticker gun, beside the canned tomatoes, beside the journal that contained the confession of the man who had dismantled her life. Her voice was steady, quiet, free of anger, not because the anger wasn't there, but because it had been processed so thoroughly over so many decades that what remained was something harder, denser, more durable. "I knew who he was. The second time he drove through town, sit in that rental car, watching my store like he was waiting for permission to get out. I recognized him. He was older, grayer, but the jaw was the same. The way he held his hands on the steering wheel tight, like he was holding something that might get away from him." Wren waited. Opal's eyes met hers, level, clear. "I never said anything because there was nothing to say. He took what he took. The town is what it is. Saying his name out loud wouldn't have rebuilt the mill or brought Gerald home." She paused. "But you're not him." The sentence hung in the air between them, simple, declarative, carrying more weight than its 5 words should have been able to hold. "No," Wren said. "I'm not. But I have what he left, the money that came from this place, the land he bought back, the deeds to 14 parcels, the mill site, the storefronts, the school lot, the water facility." Opal's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A door that had been closed for decades, not locked, just closed, resting against its frame, waiting for a pressure it could justify opening for. Wren's voice dropped lower, the words coming from a place beneath strategy, beneath planning, from the same place where the relief had found her on the vault floor months ago. "I'm not asking for forgiveness on his behalf. I'm asking whether this town wants to try again." Opal picked up her reading glasses, put them back on, looked past the journal on the counter, through the front window, toward Main Street, the boarded storefronts, the cracked sidewalks, the church steeple where Wallace's scaffold still leaned, waiting for him to resume his one-man campaign against gravity. Her voice carried the careful weight of a woman making a decision she had been preparing for without knowing it. "You'd better come sit down. We have a lot to talk about." 6 weeks after that conversation, 18 months after the reading of Edmund's will, the rain in Seattle fell in a relentless gray sheet against the floor-to-ceiling windows of a downtown corporate high-rise. The city below moved in slow, wet patterns, headlights reflecting off pavement, pedestrians hunched under umbrellas, the rhythm of a November afternoon grinding toward darkness. Wren stood by the glass in a conference room on the 14th floor. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer over dark denim, a pair of leather boots that cost more than her old monthly rent. No diamonds, no cashmere, no visible transformation except the posture straighter, settled, the posture of someone standing on ground she had tested herself. The glass door opened. Pemberton entered first, his movements carrying the careful economy of a man conserving energy for the parts that mattered. Behind him came Margot. Behind Margot came Sterling. 18 months had not been kind. Margot's frame was thinner. The cream cashmere was gone, replaced by a dark blazer that didn't quite fit off the rack, hastily chosen, a costume worn by someone who no longer had a wardrobe department. She carried a generic leather tote where the designer bags used to be. Her face was drawn, the skin around her eyes tight with the particular strain of a woman who had spent a year watching the distance between her self-image. Her reality widened into a gap she couldn't bridge with confidence alone. Sterling was worse. The navy suit hung loose on a frame that had lost weight in the wrong places, the kind of weight loss that comes from skipped meals, sleepless nights, the metabolic cost of chronic financial anxiety. The dark circles beneath his eyes had deepened into permanent shadows. The phone he used to scroll through with restless confidence stayed in his pocket. He had nothing left to scroll toward. They stopped when they saw Wren. Margot's reaction was immediate, sharp, a reflex conditioned by years of hierarchical certainty. What is she doing here? This is a private negotiation for the commercial portfolio restructuring. This has nothing to do with her. Sterling's response was slower, heavier, weighted with the exhaustion of a man who had stopped believing in surprises. Look, Wren, if you need a loan, this isn't a good time. We're in the middle of a significant restructuring. Restructuring. The word was a silk curtain drawn over a fire. Sterling's commercial portfolio was hemorrhaging cash. 2 of the structural violation lawsuits had settled against him, draining the operating reserves. 3 tenants had defaulted. The holding company's line of credit had been called by the bank. Margot's trust remained frozen. The IRS audit grinding forward with the implacable patience of a federal agency that has no reason to hurry. She had sold the tennis bracelet. She had sold the Monterey Estate's furniture. She was 3 months from selling the estate itself. Wren walked to the head of the long oak conference table. She didn't sit. She placed a single manila folder on the polished surface, the same shade of cream, the same weight of cardstock as the folder Pemberton had slid across his mahogany desk 18 months ago. The echo was deliberate. The symmetry was not lost on anyone in the room. Her voice was calm, level, carrying no malice, no triumph. No trace of the 17-year-old girl who had stopped hurting because hurting required hope. I don't need a loan, Sterling. I'm here because of the buyout offer. Sterling lowered himself into a chair. The motion was careful, controlled, the movement of a man conserving what remained of his dignity. The buyout offer came from Iron Ridge Holdings, an anonymous private equity firm. Pemberton said they were willing to absorb the outstanding debt on the commercial portfolio, the Monterey estate, the holding company liabilities, full transfer of title in exchange for debt clearance. That's correct. Pemberton confirmed, his voice soft, his eyes on the table. Margot crossed her arms. Her gaze moved from Pemberton to Wren with the focused suspicion of someone assembling a conclusion they don't want to reach. So what does that have to do with you? Are you delivering documents for them? Wren rested her fingertips on the manila folder. Iron Ridge Holdings isn't a private equity firm, Margot. It's a limited liability company. I formed it 11 months ago. The silence that followed had physical properties. It occupied space. It displaced air. It pressed against the windows, the walls, the polished oak surface of a table that had hosted 100 negotiations, but never one where the geometry of power inverted this completely, this quietly. Sterling stopped breathing. His mouth opened slightly, closed, opened again, the mechanical motion of a man whose cognitive machinery had seized. Margot's arms dropped to her sides. The color drained from her face in a slow, visible tide, leaving behind a pallor that made her look 10 years older in the span of 3 seconds. Sterling's voice was barely audible. "You? With what?" Wren tapped the folder. 6.2 million, cash. To clear your debts, settle your outstanding legal obligations, release the IRS hold on the family trust. Both of you walk out clean. No creditors. No lawsuits. No tax liens. A modest but genuine fresh start. She paused, letting the numbers settle into the room like sediment dropping to the bottom of a disturbed pool. "In exchange, I take the properties, the holding company, everything Edmund built above ground." Sterling's face progressed through a sequence of expressions that moved too quickly to catalog individually: shock, denial, calculation, recognition, defeat. The calculation was the longest. She could see him running the numbers, checking the math against his own forensic accountant's findings, arriving at the only conclusion the data supported. His voice came out hoarse, stripped raw. The cabin, he buried it there, under the floor. Wren didn't confirm. She didn't need to. Sterling already knew. He had known since the day he called her at the hardware store, since the day Sable told him the trust was airtight. He had known, in the particular way that intelligent, ambitious people know things they refuse to accept fully, completely, while simultaneously constructing elaborate architectures of denial to keep the knowledge from reaching the part of the brain that makes decisions. Margot's composure collapsed. Not dramatically, no shouting, no tears, no theatrical display. It collapsed the way a building collapses when the foundation has been compromised for years. A settling, a shift, a slow lateral movement followed by the quiet, devastating sound of structural failure. Her voice was thin, fractured. "That money belonged to the estate. It should have been divided equally. This isn't you can't. It was physical property on land legally deeded to me through an irrevocable trust executed 4 years before Edmund's death." Wren's voice carried a sharp edge of authority that surprised even her. Not cruelty, not vindication, but the clear, clean sound of someone who had earned the right to stand where she was standing. Pemberton verified the legality. The probate court dismissed Sterling's challenge. "The matter is settled." Pemberton gave a single, measured nod. Sterling stared at the polished oak. The surface reflected his face back at him, distorted, stretched, unfamiliar. He was looking at a version of himself he didn't recognize, the version that had lost, not through incompetence or bad luck, but through the precise, premeditated design of a dead man who had seen through his performance decades before it ended. His voice was quiet, stripped of anger, stripped of ambition, stripped of everything except the raw, irreducible question: why? Why buy our debt? Why not take the money, disappear? You could have let us crash. Nobody would have blamed you. Wren looked at her brother. She saw the exhaustion, the same bone-deep, grinding exhaustion she had carried for years, working double shifts at the hardware store, choosing between car repairs, dental visits, winter coats. She recognized it the way you recognize a language you grew up speaking but abandoned in adulthood. It was still there, beneath the suit, beneath the education, beneath the years of expensive confidence. The same weight, the same gray. She didn't hate them. She had considered it briefly in the early months after finding the vault. She had imagined scenarios, walking away, letting them drown, watching from a comfortable distance as the empire they had been handed collapsed around them. The fantasy was appealing in the abstract. In practice, it required a sustained investment of emotional energy that Wren could not justify. Hatred was a luxury, like cashmere, like vintage automobiles. It cost more than it was worth. Her voice carried no triumph, no pity, just the solid, grounded weight of a decision that had been made months ago, tested against every argument, every doubt, every late-night recalculation, found sound, because Edmund built something real before he lost his way. Because this family doesn't end as a cautionary tale someone tells at a dinner party. You sign the papers, your debts disappear, you get to start over. But I run the board. The estate is mine. She opened the folder, pushed 2 bound contracts across the oak surface, along with a pen black, heavy, unadorned. My offer expires at noon. Then she added something the contracts didn't contain, something she had carried from Bitter Creek, from the journal, from the 14 deeds in the lockbox. Part of the money is going back to Bitter Creek, the town Edmund gutted to build everything you spent the last 20 years enjoying. He bought the land back. I'm going to rebuild it." Margot blinked. Her voice came out small, confused. "Rebuild what?" "The mill site, the storefronts, the school, the water system, the town." Wren held her sister's gaze. "He took its foundation. I'm going to put one back." Sterling picked up the pen. He didn't read the contract. He didn't ask for revisions. He signed on the designated line quickly, sharply, with the mechanical efficiency of a man cutting a cord he no longer had the strength to hold. His signature was smaller than Wren remembered from the document she had seen at Pemberton's office. Compressed, diminished. Margot stood motionless for a long moment, the pen in her hand. The contract opened before her. Her eyes moved from the signature line to Wren's face, searching for something gloating perhaps, or satisfaction, some outward sign that this moment was a performance of revenge she could reject on moral grounds. She found nothing. Wren's expression was steady, unreadable, the face of a woman who had stopped performing for her family's approval a lifetime ago. Margot signed. Her hand shook. The pen left a faint tremor in the ink, a seismograph recording the precise moment the Calloway power structure shifted on its axis, permanently, irreversibly, without ceremony. Wren collected the contracts, placed them in the folder, closed it. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She watched Margot gather her tote bag, watched Sterling push back from the table with the slow, heavy movement of a man rising from something he wasn't sure he'd survived. They left the room without saying goodbye. The glass door closed behind them with a soft pneumatic hiss. Pemberton remained seated. His voice was barely above a murmur. "Edmund would have appreciated how you handled that." Wren looked at the old lawyer. "Edmund didn't handle anything. He wrote letters, hid gold, hired you to deliver envelopes on a timer. Handling it means standing in the room when it happens." Pemberton inclined his head. "A concession, a recognition. The difference between architects who draw plans from a distance, builders who stand in the dust." Spring came to Bitter Creek the way it always had, slowly, grudgingly, the snow retreating up the mountain slopes in patches that shrank by inches rather than acres. The Douglas firs held their green through the winter, but the deciduous trees along the creek budded in late March, their branches producing a pale green haze that softened the harsh geometry of the town's boarded-up buildings. But the geometry was changing. The former sawmill site had been cleared, leveled, reinforced. A new structure was rising, not a mill, not a factory, but a community workshop. Timber frame construction using local Douglas fir, milled at a portable sawmill Wren had purchased, operated by a crew of 6 workers hired from small towns in the Cascade corridor, where skilled tradespeople were plentiful but steady work was not. The building would house a woodworking cooperative, a tool library, a commercial kitchen available for rent, practical infrastructure designed to create the conditions for a local economy rather than import one. Wallace Greer had abandoned his solo scaffold on the church steeple. He was supervising the woodworking shop installation, his 73-year-old hands guiding younger carpenters through joinery techniques they hadn't learned in trade school. The steeple was finished fresh cedar clapboard, painted white, gleaming against the mountain sky like a bone-clean exclamation point at the end of Main Street. Ruth Halford's classroom had moved. The elementary school gymnasium had a new roof, standing seam metal, rated for the Cascade snow loads that had collapsed the original. Ruth still taught 8 children, but there were 3 more families asking about enrollment for the fall. 3 families who had heard, through the quiet networks of small-town Oregon, that something was happening in Bitter Creek. Dale Pruitt's gas station had 2 new pumps. The vacant lot next to Marsden's General was no longer vacant. A small public garden had been planted there, raised beds of herbs, vegetables, native wildflowers, tended by a rotating group of residents who treated the garden the way Wallace treated the steeple, as an act of defiance against the assumption that small places are supposed to disappear. Opal stood on the porch of Marsden's General one morning, watching the traffic on Main Street. Traffic. The word would have been absurd 6 months ago. Now it meant 2 pickup trucks, a delivery van, a county inspector's sedan, 4 vehicles moving with purpose in a town that had grown accustomed to stillness. She held a mug of coffee, watching Wren cross the street from the workshop site, sawdust on her boots, a rolled blueprint under one arm, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated a lumber delivery with a supplier in Eugene. Opal didn't wave, she didn't call out. She watched with the steady gaze of a woman who had spent 45 years keeping a store open in a town that had every reason to close, who had outlasted the slow erosion not through optimism but through the stubborn, unreasonable refusal to be the one who turned off the lights. Something had shifted, not overnight, not dramatically. The shift had been gradual, a new face at the gas station, a sound of hammering from the mill site, a light on in a storefront that had been dark for a decade. The subtraction had paused. For the first time in 45 years, the number wasn't getting smaller. Wren didn't live in Portland anymore. She didn't live in Seattle. She lived in the cabin on Hemlock Ridge, the same cabin, the same half-acre lot, the same mountain. But the cabin was no longer a rotting wooden box sinking into the mud. The roof was new. The porch was level. The siding had been replaced with cedar planks milled on site, their surfaces carrying the warm, reddish tone of fresh-cut wood that hadn't yet been weathered by the Cascade rains. Inside, the cast-iron stove had been replaced by a modern wood-burning insert. The warped floorboards were gone, new pine sealed level, warm underfoot. The vault was still there. Beneath the new floor, behind the steel plate she had repainted to match the surrounding wood, the concrete stairwell descended to the olive-drab door with its rotary wheel, its keypad still blinking green. The shelves were mostly empty now. The gold had become lumber, roofing, wages, permits, survey stakes, seed money for a cooperative that didn't exist 6 months ago. The silver had become a gymnasium roof, gas pumps, a commercial kitchen with stainless steel counters where a local baker was already testing sourdough recipes using flour milled in the Willamette Valley. She sat on the porch in the evening light. The sun was going down behind the ridgeline, painting the tops of the Douglas firs in shades of amber, copper, deep gold. Below in the valley, Bitter Creek's lights were coming on, not many, not yet, but more than last year. Each light a small, defiant argument against the darkness. In her hand, the brass key. She had cleaned it months ago, polished away the green oxidation, rubbed the brass until it shone with a warm, buttery luster she hadn't known it possessed. The 6 numbers were visible now, stamped crisp into the metal, 824096. The code that opened a door, the code that started everything. She didn't need the key anymore. The vault was open. The gold was spent. The secret was told. But she kept it, carried it in her jacket pocket every day, felt its weight against her thigh through the denim, not as a talisman, not as a souvenir, as evidence, proof that someone had seen her when the rest of the world looked through her, proof that the man who noticed everything had noticed the one thing that mattered most, not talent, not ambition, not the ability to perform devotion on command, but the willingness to tell an uncomfortable truth to a powerful person who didn't want to hear it. She turned the key over in her fingers. The metal caught the last of the evening light. The journal sat beside her on the porch, closed. Now its leather cover softened by months of handling. Its pages read so many times the binding had loosened. She wouldn't open it again tonight. She didn't need to. The words she carried weren't on the pages anymore. They were in the gymnasium roof, in the workshop walls, in the garden beds beside Opal's store, in the fresh paint on Dale's gas pumps. One line from the final page. One line she hadn't shared with anyone, not Opal, not Pemberton, not the workers at the mill site, not the families beginning to ask about Bitter Creek with cautious, hopeful curiosity. She kept it private, the way Edmund had kept his visits private, the way some truths are too essential to expose to weather. The best foundations are the ones nobody sees. Wren slipped the key back into her pocket, stood up from the porch, walked inside, where the wood stove was warming the cabin, where the new floor was solid beneath her feet, where the evening was settling into the quiet, patient rhythm of a place that had decided, against all reasonable expectation, to keep going. Below her, the vault sat empty. The shelves that had held a fortune now held nothing but filtered air. The quiet hum of dehumidifiers running on a propane system that would continue operating long after there was nothing left to protect. The vault had served its purpose. It had held $10 million in gold, silver currency. It had held a letter from a dead man. It had held a journal full of confessions. It had held the deeds to a town. Now it held something else. Something Edmund might not have intended. Something the numbers on the brass key could never have encoded. The weight of a life that had been dismissed, underestimated, ignored, measured against the weight of a life that had chosen, when given the power to punish, to build instead. If this story of hidden treasure, family justice, quiet redemption meant something to you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight. What would you do if you inherited not just money, but the chance to repair what someone before you had broken? Think about that as you close your eyes. Subscribe so you never miss our next story. Sleep well, the foundations hold.